Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Case for Engaged Journalism. I'm not Amanda Zamora. Poor Amanda is ill. She's taken ill, and she's not here with us today. Anyway, we'll carry on. So this is about engaged journalism, and very often when you attend panels about engagement, in management speak, that means how you get more traffic to your websites or how you build your user base. This is not that. It's as David Bowie described in that '99 interview, it's about the grey space between user and provider, and it's really about how you bring your audience and your communities into your journalism to strengthen that journalism. And one of the points we'll be discussing is whether we're at that point of a renaissance in journalism now, where crowdsourcing and engagement becomes part of what we do in storytelling and in doing good journalism. With us today are Josh Stearns, who leads the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation's Journalism Sustainability Project. That's focused on developing new revenue models for local news rooted in community engagement and creative collaboration. Beside me we have Mary Hamilton, who's executive editor of audience at The Guardian, and she helps maximize the reach for Guardian's work around the world, but also builds meaningful relationships between Guardian journalism and its audience. Larry Macaulay, founder, host and presenter for the Refugee Radio Network, a platform organized by refugees for refugees in Hamburg in Germany. It was founded in 2014. And myself, I'm Malachy Brown. I'm managing editor of Reportedly. It's a first look media outfit, and we leverage social media to cover international news, conflict, social movements, and tech news. So we're going to get started with presentations. Josh is up first.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. A little bit louder now. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right. You didn't think you were going to be able to come to an engagement session without being engaged, right? Good. We expect this to be a really good conversation, a good back and forth, and we really look forward to talking with all of you once we get through a little bit of how we think about engagement and what engagement means for us. So I wanted to start out telling you a little bit about the work I do at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, which is a place-based foundation in New Jersey in the USA. And we're working on a project right now where we're looking at how can we help support the future of local news, specifically a strong financial future for local news, in part by changing the way we do journalism to orient it more around community engagement. So we really think that if we need to rebuild how we do journalism and think about journalism much more rooted in communities and serving local communities if we want communities to continue to support journalism in new ways. And so we're testing a range of new membership models, event strategies, other kinds of services that news organizations can provide, but all of which are rooted in actually meeting concrete needs in local communities. And we are also experimenting with new reporting models that connect revenue strategies and community engagement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those today, but I want to talk about them within a framework that I hope is really helpful to you. It's a framework that we've used as we've been thinking about community engagement, and it's a 3-level framework that was first introduced by Joy Mayer, and I'm going to give you a link to her work as well. But the first one that Joy talks about, this is a map of some of the local journalism sites we work with in New Jersey. The first level that Joy talks about is community outreach. And I should say that these are levels as ways of creating a framework. They're not levels in terms of a hierarchy that suggest any one kind of engagement is more or less valuable. I think the type of engagement you choose to pursue should be related to the goals that you're trying to meet and the needs of your communities. So this isn't to say level 1 is less valuable than level 3. But level 1, community outreach. For Joy and the way that we've thought about this, it's sharing ourselves and our expertise with our communities and our content. It's taking content out to the audience, not assuming that we'll just put it on our website and expect them to come to us. And it's being willing to participate in our community as individuals, as human beings connected to our community in ways outside of our newsroom, not just as relation to us as a reporter. And so I really like to point out the work of the Center for Investigative Reporting, also called REVEAL, and their earlier project called California Watch, which did some really great work on this, two of which you can see on the slide here. So they did this really in-depth investigative series about lead jewelry that was showing up in California, even though California had outlawed these lead jewelries. This really cheap jewelry was showing up in department stores in California. And so they revealed this and showed how this lead was having an effect on people and the importance of getting this lead out of your homes. But they went a step further. They actually rented lead testing equipment. You can see a picture of it on the slide there. This kind of equipment is incredibly expensive. So it's not like the sort of thing that somebody could do in their own home. But they were able to rent this equipment as part of their investigation. And then they created community drop-in zones where anybody could bring their jewelry from home and get it tested for lead. So not only was that serving the community in a very direct public health way, it was also making that journalism relevant to the community in a really direct way and helping spread the word about this reporting. Similarly, they did an investigation on the earthquake readiness of local schools in California. And who is going to be most impacted by earthquake readiness of local schools? The kids who go to them. But the kids who go to them aren't going to read a 40-page investigative journalism piece. What they will read is a comic book. So the Center for Investigative Reporting took their journalism and worked with child psychologists and illustrators and created an age-appropriate comic book to discuss the findings of their research and talk to kids about the safety of their own schools in a way that was really appropriate and engaging. And that, of course, also led to having discussions with parents and led to their journalism having a real impact on families. So that's one piece where they've gone out into the community and done community outreach. Another example, moving to level 2, is what we look at as conversation. And this is more and more journalism is being created as a way to spark conversation with communities in ways where the journalism actually changes through that conversation. So this really means starting to listen in new ways, hosting discussions in person and online, participating in conversations that we're not necessarily hosting. So it's not always about us holding an event, but also us going to other conversations. And then recognizing that journalism is a process and that the process itself can change the journalism as we go along. I wanted to give you two concrete examples of this. The first one is Justin Auciello, the person in the top picture there, is an urban planner by trade. He hasn't had any formal journalism education. And he created a Facebook page just before one of the big hurricanes hit the New Jersey shore. And he just wanted to make sure that he could connect people and give appropriate safety information out to people. And that was 5 years ago. Now that Facebook page has 220,000 fans. It's more fans than the big public radio station, WNYC, and ProPublica combined. And it has become a daily news site that's done in collaboration with the community. So those 220,000 fans on Facebook, he calls them contributors. And he reports with them on a daily basis where they send him tips. He uses eyewitness media. He reports it out. He builds on it. He verifies. He fact checks. He constantly goes back to his community. The entire thing is a conversation with his community. And he's actually creating revenue models around this, even though it's on Facebook. And I'd be happy to talk later about how he's monetizing that. But he has always focused generally on community and conversation. The other piece is the Listening Post in New Orleans, which is a project I'm really excited to be bringing to New Jersey. And you'll see there's a sign. In the US, we have these signs all over a lot of urban centers. And the signs tend to be something like, we buy old houses, or we'll give you a job to work from home. Things like these sort of odd pitches. This journalist at the Listening Post turned this on its head and actually put signs up there asking the community for input and giving them a number to text. And they used this great program called Ground Source, created by Andrew Haig, who was on the panel earlier here, the last panel. And so using Ground Source and using microphones placed in communities, that bottom image there is a microphone in a community disguised as sort of a fish. And they asked people to come give their responses via text messages and audio. And then they use those in the storytelling. So you've got this back and forth between the community and the newsroom that becomes part of the stories and helps diversify the voices that are represented in the journalism. And then the last level is collaboration. And this is really getting into a shared investment where we have a deep investment in the journalism, but our communities also have a deep investment and a deep influence. And you can imagine if we're deeply collaborating with our communities, they are going to want to support that journalism in new ways. So we're soliciting and relying on user contributions in new ways. We're allowing the communities to actually shape what we cover to some extent. And we're accomplishing things with the community that we could never do alone because we have so many more people helping us look into issues. And so I've got 3 examples here I wanted to point out to you. One was actually discussed in the last panel for those of you who were here at Capital Public Radio. They actually create working groups with the community before their investigations who help throughout the whole investigation. And they go so far as to create memorandums of agreement and understanding between the journalists and the community about what they hope to accomplish over the course of the investigation. So this is one of their working groups here. The second image down is a tool called Hearken. And Hearken is this public-powered, curiosity-driven journalism platform that uses questions and curiosity from the community to help drive the reporting, but also brings community members out on the reporting with them. It's an amazing, amazing project. And we're just bringing that to New Jersey as well during some of our work. I'll post a link to all of that soon. The last one I wanted to point out is Radio Lab, a podcast some of you might be familiar with, hosted at WNYC in New York City. And Radio Lab actually, this is a kit to build a soil sensor so that anybody across the US could actually test the temperature of their soil to track an insect that was growing across the US, cicadas. So they created this small, simple kit, and they asked people, hundreds of people up and down the East Coast of the United States, to actually do this investigation with them, help them collect data, and make this thing together. And so we're seeing this new generation of hands-on journalism where people are actually making tools to help the reporting and to gather data. And that makes people much more invested in the journalism, so they spread it, they share it, then they support it. So those are the pieces I wanted to talk about for what we're experimenting with, and give you the sort of 3 levels as a framework for how you might think about your own journalism and where different kinds of collaboration and community engagement fit in that. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Josh. Mary Hamilton, The Guardian, is next.
Give me 2 seconds while I find my presentation.
If you just hit enter, it should automatically go on to the next slide.
Okay, that's not my Twitter handle, but okay. Okay, hi folks. Hi. See, this is a lovely room to start talking to first thing in the morning, because you've all clearly had coffee. So I want to talk a little bit about one specific project that The Guardian's been working on. The Guardian does quite a lot of engaged journalism, quite a lot of community work, quite a lot of work on developing audiences and reaching them and getting them to come back to us regularly and getting them to engage with us. But I wanted to talk about one particular project that combines all of those things with some quite serious journalism on quite a serious issue. This is The Counted. If we could rely on the Wi-Fi, I'd be taking you through it live. It's a page that exists on the internet. You can find it at theguardian.com/thecounted. All one word, no hyphens. This is a project that we started last year, around about a year ago actually, which looks at the numbers of people killed during encounters with police in the United States. And the reason that we started to look at this project is as the protests began to really kind of raise awareness of the issue of young, especially black and especially men, people being killed by the police in the US in sort of 2014, 2015, it also became clear that the US doesn't actually keep any national statistics on the numbers of people killed in this way or killed during these encounters. So that seemed like a fairly obvious hole in, you know, it's very difficult to start to have a conversation about this issue, regardless of your position on it, if you just don't have the data to even know where to start. So this felt like something that we could address as journalists and something that we wanted to address as journalists. So we began to count. Last year, we counted 1,145 people killed during US police encounters. And this database is not built on official statistics in any way. Actually, well, that's not true. It's built on partial official statistics, the sort of statistics that some states and some police departments report, but not all. It's also built on other people's crowdsourced databases. It's built on local media reporting. And crucially, it's built on a community of people who we created and managed to try and help us to really kind of get into the communities where this was happening, and to understand more about the individual lives of the people involved. So this isn't just kind of raw data, looking at sort of the total. We also have, as far as possible, names, ages, circumstances of deaths, links to coverage of each death if it's possible and if it was covered. As far as possible, we have images of every single person. And the way that we get this is not just by going to local media and doing secondary reporting, it's also through that community that I spoke about. And when we started to pull these sort of sources of information together, it became very clear that actually, if we were only relying on this sort of second level, we were going to miss stories, and we were going to miss very, very human stories. In order to actually get this information, we needed to go out and find a community that probably didn't know that The Guardian existed. It's a US issue. The Guardian is nowhere near as well known in the US as it is in Europe right now. Or wasn't at the time, certainly. It's a community that doesn't necessarily trust media. It's a community that is often hurting and often feels very anti-authoritarian. And it's also a community of individual communities. The need around this story, there is an activism around this story, and there are people who care about the issue in the round. But the majority of people who care the most, who we were wanting to try and reach, are people who care about the one thing that happened to someone they know, or to a friend of a friend, or in their community. And what we needed to try and do was provide a space for those people to come to us in confidence or openly through platforms that they were comfortable with. So we couldn't rely on The Guardian's own existing reach and The Guardian's own platform to get into these communities. So we built deliberately, the US Interactives team built this so that each individual story is shareable on its own, so that we could start to put the word out about individuals and individual events. Originally, we'd thought that using the names of these people and the dates that they were killed would be enough to allow us to share each one individually. But it turned out after one day where there were 4 people, we knew that there had been 4 deaths, but we didn't know the names of any of them. That actually that system didn't work very well, and we had to give them each unique identifiers, because otherwise we couldn't start to use these to ask questions. But we took these individual stories, we take these individual stories, and we go out to our communities that we've built through Facebook and through Twitter and say, this happened, this is what we know, what do you know? Do you know any more than this? Can you help us? Can you help us find out more? And we've built communities around this. This is our Facebook page. About a week ago, I think I took these screenshots. That community now has more than 20,000 members. And part of the reason for that is that it's constantly active. We don't just share our own stories here, we share local media stories. We don't just share the things that we want to know, we also share the results of that reporting. And the journalists, the reporting team involved in this, are hugely involved in the Facebook page as well, where we have questions that come into us from members of the community, they get in there and they answer them. Where we have conversations, they try and get involved. And every single person who sends us something, who gives us information that we might not otherwise have, we say thank you, we reply. Because you can't do a project like this and have people trust that you're going to be there and available to them if they give you information and you ignore them. This is our Twitter page. Again, we keep this active in part by maintaining the count. That count is what is the sort of the drumbeat of this project, because it gives us something to talk about every single day. And this project's now been live and been active since, I think it was June we launched last year. And this is an ongoing thing. This sort of community engagement isn't something you do once and then it goes away. It takes time, it takes resources, and it takes genuine planning ahead so that there is something to say every single day. There is a conversation to be had, because this is an issue that doesn't stop. And we've run Reddit AMAs. This is a screenshot of the AMA that we ran on Reddit sort of shortly after we'd launched the project with the original reporting team. We had thousands of questions as a result of this. And some of those questions are just about why we chose this thing, why we're reporting it in this particular way, what the methodology is of this project. And from start to finish, we've been incredibly transparent about how we're doing this, why we're doing this, what the point is. The point isn't to point fingers, the point isn't to apportion blame, the point is to do the basic journalism that allows the US to actually have a national conversation about this issue, because you can't have the conversation unless you have the information that you need to start. And we've built community guidelines for our Facebook page, for our Twitter page, and for our site that begin with that as the basic principle. This isn't about blame, and this isn't about apportioning blame. Those communities, as well, as we've started to enforce those guidelines, have started to self-police and self-moderate. So people who come in and say, how dare you, why aren't you also counting police, will tend to get met by other community members sending them the links to the official US statistics that record police deaths on the job and saying this exists because we don't have it anywhere else. This is our tips form. It's completely anonymous. It goes to an email address. Everything we get, if somebody gives us an email address or some way of replying to them, we reply, we say thank you. Ooh, sorry, I've just gone beyond the end of the presentation. But yeah, that's the Counted. That's the biggest. It's a huge kind of comprehensive project. And what's interesting is that it hasn't just given us stories. We've had several deaths that we've only learned about through community tips that we would never have had. We would never have known about these things. They would never have gone reported or commented on if it weren't for our community talking to us and us listening and them trusting us enough that we would do something positive with that information, something that was meaningful and something that was important. And it's also true that we've been able, through that work, to get those stories out to communities that we couldn't have otherwise reached. It's a virtuous circle. This isn't just about maximising the reach of the story, it's also about maximising the way that that story reaches people and improving the journalism at the same time.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about Reportedly, and for those of you who are not familiar with Reportedly, we're a very small team of just 6 journalists, 3 in Europe, 3 in North America, and we are leveraging social networks and sources and information on social networks and publishing back direct onto social almost all of the time, but also with some stories, more traditional stories published to our website and video production. But because we're so small, we don't have huge production capacity. And I'm going to talk about our approach to engaged journalism and drawing from the crowd in a light touch way. Because we don't have developers, we don't have the big infrastructure or the infrastructure of larger news organizations. And I'm going to talk about some of the results that will really reinforce what Mary and Josh have said so far about constantly talking and listening to people and keeping conversations going. I don't have too many slides. You know, when we set out Reportedly, it was really kind of leveraging the individual communities of each of us involved in the project, and it's led by Andy Carvin. And many of you will be familiar with the work that he did through the Arab Spring as sort of a magnet for conversations and information to come to him, trying to figure out events as they were going on and identifying people that were as close to the story as possible. And he became sort of a channel for that. And that's what we tried to, that's what we, I guess, are replicating at Reportedly. Each of the 6 of us through our individual accounts, but now through the Reportedly account. And of course, that has led us to some live coverage, but of events like the Paris attacks and to attacks in Mali and so on. But maybe if I just backtrack a little bit, really what we're trying to do is organize social media so that we can draw from the people who best represent the stories that are there, who are the social gatekeepers within stories, and draw information from them, and in a timely way ask them questions, get replies, acknowledge that we don't always know what's going on, and use tips that they provide us as jumping off points to do our own traditional journalism and investigation onto that, and publish the results of that in a real-time way. And if we're wrong, or if people correct us and provide further insight, we'll natively retweet them. We're operating in Twitter very often, also on Facebook, and it's Twitter in particular is understood as a public medium, and unless your account is private. And that enables us to, I suppose, elevate the voices of people who are there. This is often described as sort of inclusive journalism, but I call it reliant journalism. As a small team of 6 who are not on the ground of these various different places, we can have windows to the world what's going on in various different places around the world, and we're really relying on those communities to provide information. And the more what we find is the more that we cover that, people start engaging with us, trying to help us, and they say, well, who's this small group called Reportedly? Why are they suddenly taking an interest in Mali, or what's going on in Somalia? And the very nature of these types of stories, international stories that aren't well served by mainstream media, gives us an advantage, because all of a sudden, a brand is paying attention to this story, and people come to us with tips. And when we have those icebreaker moments, when something else happens in those countries, people are more likely to come back to us and send us a message and say, hey, there's something going on here, do you want to check it out? Or in fact, get more involved in the journalism. We also go to the community asking for translations, asking for locations, if we want to run geo searches, local search terms that help us to uncover further information, and people respond to that. We tell them what we don't know and offer people opportunities to come back to us. So this just is an example of us covering the Paris attacks. And generally what we do is, because tweets are so ephemeral, you put one out and it disappears, we thread tweets by replying to the previous tweet and try to keep things in a steady timeline. And that allows us to resurrect previous threads if we want to reference something that happened in the past. And also in between that, we'll be putting native retweets out to our audience of people that are good sources. And this is all well and good in sort of live situations where you're drawing from the crowd, but for me, the gems of stories come from when you establish relationships with people, again, through social channels or through secure channels of communication. And because we're very public and inclusive about our coverage, people come to us with those tips, and it allows me as an individual journalist to develop those relationships in a very light touch way, by just keeping a conversation going. And it's good old journalism. It's cultivating those relationships. But I can now cultivate relationships with people in Sardinia, in Egypt, in wherever the story may be, and I'm able to investigate from a distance what's going on there. And then that helps us when we go on the ground to Calais or to Lesvos, because we've been publicly covering those stories and including people from the communities who are there at the grassroots of those stories, and really helping out the NGOs, the activists, the volunteers, as well as refugees. Then we have tremendous access to new types of stories when we actually go there, on the few occasions that we do go there. I'm going to talk a little bit just about one of those examples, when somebody came to us with a leaked cable of an arms shipment from Italy to forces that were bombing Yemen. And I'm going to explain that in a panel later on, go through the step-by-step process of how we prove that later on this evening. But as a result of that initial investigation, there was pickup in Italy about it, and people started coming to me on Facebook and on Twitter, and to Reportedly on Twitter, saying, we knew this was going on, now we have proof, thank you very much. And it created a community of politicians, of weapons monitors and experts here, of local people in Sardinia, that allowed us in real time to track 2 further shipments of those bombs from Elmas Airport in Sardinia, people on the tarmac, arms monitors checking the types of bombs that were photographed on the tarmac, me working with flight radar to monitor where it was going to a military airbase in Saudi Arabia. And we, in fact, through contacts in Human Rights Watch, found evidence of those very bombs on the ground in Yemen, so we knew they were being used by RWM Italia is the name of the company in Sardinia. And of course, Amnesty in Italy got involved and checked the legality of this, and believed that it contravenes not only Italian law but European and international law, given what's going on in Yemen. But that's just one example of several stories that we have, and maybe I'll tweet out a few more. I've tweeted 1 or 2 already, and actually this is us tracking it at the time. And I wouldn't have known about that were it not for the community, who 2 separate people through private channels sent me just a tip off that this was happening, and it allowed us to examine all the content from there. So that's just one example of the results. There you go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Buongiorno tutti. I've engaged with you. I'm going to engage with the guys in the booth. Will you help me with my trailer? Is it possible? Well, my name is Larry Macaulay, political refugee rights activist, a humanist, and I'm the founder of Refugee Radio Network in Hamburg. I will just take you along a storyline. I'm sorry I don't have much presentations to show on screen because of some technicalities. I will narrate a story of a group of refugees who felt marginalized and decided to take action, decided to engage. I've been in Europe from the Libyan war in 2011. When I came to Europe, alongside 55,000 to 60,000 people from the Libyan war and from other nationalities, we found out that this society, the European society, didn't really want us. And the society even didn't know why we were there, what happened in Libya, war, was this war, you know? All these things was on the news, but we found out arriving that people were not aware of that. So the necessity to engage with local community was there. I was in Italy for 3 years before we were kicked out in 2013. And many of us found our way to different North European countries. I found my way to a city called Hamburg in North Germany. And Hamburg afforded us the opportunity to be active politically, in the sense of we were manifesting on the street, protesting on the streets to agitate for inclusion and social rights, you know, for acceptance as human beings, not to treat us as foreigners or as aliens. And getting to Hamburg and starting to engage, we found out that citizens, communities didn't even know what was happening in Italy, not to talk of what was happening in war zones across the world. So a group of us, refugees, all of us, myself, two other colleagues, we decided to create an alternative platform to get our voices out. Since there was a lot of toxic narration in mainstream media, news reports were flying all over the place that these people were terrorists, they were mercenaries, and they are a danger to our community, we need to kick them out. So we decided to create a voice for ourselves, and that's why we created the Refugee Radio platform, which was, we started as a radio program to engage with the local community. And afterwards, engaging took us along a very lengthy process. Legalities were there. Everybody told us it was not possible. We didn't have the legal status or anything to do such, to embark on such journey. But I was determined. I'm someone who doesn't give up. And I said, okay, don't worry, we will do. Then we engaged with the unions, movements, and we discussed, and a little opportunity came through a community radio station. And they allowed us to have a voice on radio, a refugee voice. One of the first, if not the only one in Germany at that time, in October, November 2014. We started it, 3 of us, we engaged, we went on social media, opened a Facebook page, Twitter page, G+, whatever we could find, and we started engaging with refugee groups all over Europe. As refugees, I want to make something very clear. Before we came into that refugee community, we were human beings, we had smartphones, we had laptops, you know, most of us were professionals. So this thinking that refugees they come from a strange planet, they don't know this, they don't know that, we deconstructed that and try to explain that we have smartphones, we are on Facebook, and being in a refugee camp for almost 2 years or 3 years, you are in an empty space. So many refugees engage and relate to each other on social media, Facebook. So that was why we brought Facebook into the platform. Okay, let's get on Facebook, register it, and let's start connecting with all our friends who are refugees. Then, when we did that, we did the first show in December 2014. The response was positive. People were calling into the live show in the studios, 2 hours. Community people, Germans, refugees from all over the globe who were following us also on Facebook. Then onwards, we found a way into the Hamburg community, the local community. And we started engaging with them, some of them, most of them positive, a few negative reports. And onwards from then on, other people started engaging with us from the outside. I was shocked. People, organizations calls us from Australia, from America. Then we engaged with mainstream media, despite the fact that they were one of our oppositions from the beginning. I call them the Goliath of everything, and we are the David. Then, of course, my group increased from 3 to 5, from 5 to 8, and we started getting reports about refugees in refugee camps, because at that time, this was before the explosion of the refugee thing, of the migration thing. You attend refugee discussions all over Europe. Refugees are not inclusive. Nobody is there to represent. No media house is there to report about it. So we decided to say, okay, we go into that shoes. We fill that gap. And we were doing that along the line. So we now didn't want to stay in a small confined space in Hamburg, in that basement where we started. So we decided to engage with as much people who contact us as. So Al Jazeera called us. We were on the stream twice on a refugee discussion. Other media outlets started calling us, NPR, The Takeaway Show, Deutsche Welle, Radio France. So that's how we took Refugee Radio Network, a small project, into the mainstream so that people, the expansion can grow. As of today, we syndicate across Germany on community radio senders, which we call free radios or community radios, in 7 localities across Germany. We have an online stream we developed ourselves by Refugees for Refugees, and we are broadcasting online stream 24 hours a day on the internet. For me, it is very important to note that as refugees, the borders are everywhere in our lives. Everywhere we go, we face discrimination of one sort or the other, even in the media, even as I speak. So it is very important for me to be visible, for us to be visible and continue to empower ourselves as refugees, and also to engage with people and deconstruct this fear that lies between the migrant and the others on the other side. So this is why we have decided to act, because if we did not act by starting this small project in Hamburg, I will not be here today. So I have engaged with as much people that reaches out to me, and I'm trying to engage with more. Be that as it may, we have a followership. We are not so big also, because we started in 2014. We don't have money. All this money comes from our pockets or our friends to buy cheap equipment and stuff like that. But we tried as much as possible to reach out, and the following is growing as we speak on a daily basis. So I just employ people to check us out on the internet, www.refugeeradionetwork.net. After this discussion, you can come to me. I'll give you some information more about the Refugee Radio platform. And if it's possible for the guys in the booth to play the trailer, it would be nice for the people to see what we're doing. If you can play it, is it possible? No. Okay, that's not possible, so thank you very much.
So we've got about 40 minutes left, and we'll have a little discussion here with the guys, and then very quickly open it up to the floor for questions. You know, as I said in the intro, engagement still very much means growth within newsrooms, and these examples show how the return on that true engagement, the investment of true engagement, happens. How do you justify the resources within newsrooms, or what's your advice to other newsrooms? Maybe Mary first.
I think there's one. Hang on, is this on? Can you all hear me? Good. I think if there's one thing I'd say, it's probably that it's important to bear in mind that growth and community tend to go hand in hand. It's very difficult to grow the depth of community engagement with what you do without also growing the larger addressable audience of what you do. And there are some projects where the entire point is to get community engagement, to get community involvement. And I think that, you know, as some of these projects demonstrate, there's not necessarily a lot of point in doing some of these things if they don't reach a readership. They're not just serving the community that wants to speak, but they're also serving communities that want to read. I think there's a tendency to think about the audience as sort of an amorphous blob that sort of turns up as a massive stream of clicks or as eyeballs. We talk about eyeballs and it's really quite weird because what we're actually talking about is humans. And humans like reading about other humans. We all as people want to know about other people in the world. And when we think about the way that we serve communities, we aren't just talking about the way that we go out to them, speak with them, interact with them, but we're also talking about that interaction serving many, many more people who might not be willing to speak, might not be able to speak, might not have the resources to speak with us, but who benefit from from consuming what results from those conversations.
I think jumping off of that as well, there's a question about when you talk about growth, what are you trying to grow? A lot of us are trying to grow not just numbers, but grow relationships, grow trust, grow a sense of loyalty to the organization, a sense of connection. And I think that community engagement can grow numbers, but it also grows these other things, which are relationships with the news organization that make people come back, that make people feel a level of trust, that make people want to become members, that make all these other things happen as well. And so when we talk about growth, we need to talk about these other aspects of growth too. And I think related to that, if you look at two of the examples that I pointed to in my slides, one, Capital Public Radio was originally, their community engagement was really originally being done by an independent contractor, someone who had kind of been brought in part-time on a short contract to help them sort of fool around with community engagement, see if it was worth sticking with, essentially. And after her first project with them, they were so blown away by the diversity of new voices of people who were being involved in the journalism, as well as the new communities they were reaching because of this work. They were reaching, this is a public radio station that didn't traditionally have deep reach into diverse communities in the area where they were. And they were all of a sudden being read and trafficked by a whole different set of readers. And similarly, in Chicago, where the Harkin platform was originally created as Curious City, Curious City was something like only 15% or less of the stories that the WBEZ, this radio station, did, but it was something like 70% of the most popular stories that they did. So these folks, these stories are not just good journalism, but they're deeply popular, and people spend a lot more time on site because they feel really engaged with them. So we can talk about lots of different kinds of metrics, but all those metrics, I think, are ways of looking at whether we're building strong communities.
And Larry, from the reverse perspective, you founded your community because there was nothing that was serving you, but also you weren't being heard in the mainstream media. Did the goals of what you were trying to achieve change as mainstream became interested in engaging with you?
Yeah, well, as a community, a new community in a new community of Europe, we are people of different colors, different cultures, different education, different integration. So it's very important that we engage with the other side, which is the community. And When we started, there was nothing, like I said. But now, mainstream media has shown interest, and we must continue to be in that shoes, in that space, and continue to push and fight so that the negative reports that we still see in mainstream media. We woke up to the new year of refugees raping Europeans, and everybody believed that. So it's very important that we continue to engage with mainstream media to change a little bit or to take it down. Don't project things from most people. I've seen reporters, journalists, professionals who call themselves professional journalists. They just called me on telephone, Refugee Radio, we want to do an interview with you. They didn't even go to the website and research. They ask me things that is already, information that are already there. So I now start to re-educate them, about things. So it's very important that we engage.
And are there news organizations who you've established regular contact with? We heard the importance of conversations, of maintaining those conversations.
Yeah, regularly we get invitations to talk on Al Jazeera sometimes. At the moment, we are much more focused on community radio because we are in local community. We are not in the world. I'm in a local community in Hamburg. So it's very important for me and refugee groups in every city to have a voice in that community that they are, so that we can bring all this together into one platform. That's the idea.
Okay, fantastic. We heard, moving from newsrooms strategy to individual journalists, we heard yesterday in the panel that you were in, Mary, Matthew Ingram talking about the reluctance of journalists to engage with comments, with readers, that sort of thing. On an individual level, how do you get the buy-in?
Sometimes it's quite hard to persuade journalists there are things they might not know. It shouldn't be, given our jobs, but there we are. I think sort of getting buy-in from the newsroom is in part about deciding the stories that you actually want to tell and being able to be involved in the planning process as early as you possibly can around to try and think about how we can tell stories more effectively in the right forms that work for the people that we think we want to consume them. A lot of stories start with the story and then we think about the audience. I think some of the best community work starts with the audience and then we think about how we're going to tell the story, how we're going to bring those people into the work that we do. Some of the best stories start with a tip-off, and every journalist's been in that situation where an unexpected source has given you an unexpected piece of information and it's got the potential to turn into something enormous. And the internet's given us the capacity to broaden the potential network for any journalist, to broaden the potential number of people who might have that unexpected piece of information and might give it to you. But it's also made it even more important for it to be clear that as a journalist you are available and that you can be trusted with that piece of information. And I think a lot of what we talk about actually comes back to that issue of trust. The newsroom has to trust that this process is going to be solid, that it's going to result in good journalism. The people who are involved at the other end need to trust that as a journalist you're going to do something with that information and that you're not going to, that you're going to give them credit for their contribution, that you're going to engage with them as part of a longer process, that this won't just be something that they throw into a void. And so as a journalist, it's your job, I think, to carry that trust and to be available and to be able to be trusted.
We are all creatures of habit, and sometimes those habits create a sense of narrative about our relationship with communities that are self-reinforcing. And I think one of the ways that we've worked around trying to shift the culture in newsrooms and get buy-in is actually by creating experiences for people that they wouldn't have otherwise had with community as a sort of on-ramp into thinking about deeper kinds of engagement. So we've got a project called News Voices, NEWSVOICES.org, News Voices, where we're actually doing community organizing with community stakeholders, from everything from labor communities to immigrant communities, social justice communities, around a range of issues, bringing them together and then bringing journalists to the table as well to talk about what are the major issues in local communities, how are those issues being covered, what solutions do we need to be working on, and what's the role of journalism in helping identify those solutions and inform communities about that. And really importantly, where are the stories that aren't being told? So for journalists who come, they see communities that care deeply about the future of their place and their community, and they see people who care deeply about news and information, even if they are frustrated with it. And we create a dialogue back and forth where communities are really empowered to help give journalists a sense of not just we're frustrated maybe with the coverage that we've gotten, but we also understand we need you and we want you more deeply engaged with us. And it's a really creative and productive dialogue that's turning out some amazing new connections and collaborations between newsrooms and communities. And many of these are really, really traditional newsrooms who had never really thought about going down this road before. But all of a sudden they're seeing the value of communities, and they're seeing that the communities aren't scary. These aren't angry people yelling in the comment sections. These are people who care deeply about being informed and deeply want to work with news organizations.
Malachy, I'm interested in your answer to that question.
Yeah, I think trust is the key point, and also a willingness to spend time on a story. And I think the best stories that we have done over the last year have been people who realize that we're paying attention to those stories, cover them maybe in a light touch way from day to day. But again, by organizing like just a simple Twitter list of people who are in Calais in the refugee camp, you get the pulse of what's going on there every day. And then we can push that out to our community and maybe write a story about it. But it leads to somebody sending a DM saying, hey, they're rounding up hundreds of people and flying them to the far reaches of France on airplanes, and then being able to, they trust us to do our journalism to investigate that story and uncover it. And just countless examples of that. And I think as well also thanking people publicly provided they want to be thanked. When we did that first Italian bombs story, at the end of the Twitter thread we took 3 or 4 tweets we had checked with them if they wanted to be included in the credits of as contributors to the investigation, but just thanked them using their Twitter handles, which kind of created a group of people then in the background who could chat day to day and share information and developments, and politicians then got involved and picked it up in the Italian Parliament, and I think that just maintaining those conversations. We have the means now to do that, across boundaries, and also the trust issue. I'll also say that some of this is, I think Amanda would have touched on this were she here, is scalable. The crowdsourcing side of it, that you can bring technology to bear. And I remember they had a treasure trove of 47,000 documents that they FOI'd and put that out to the public. And they put rules around. What they asked the public to do was to extract dates and numbers and I think the local state or the local organization that were getting federal funding around something, and they invited people to contribute to that because the documents that they were provided weren't text readable, and thousands of people contributed, but they put rules around it that they had to have 3 people providing matching numbers so that it couldn't be altered in any way, and I think that there are clever ways to leverage the crowd in your community in investigative stuff as well. So we'll open it up to the floor. Interested in any questions, any comments, or any other stories that you believe are being missed because there's no community or collaborative approach, or examples of the same. We get a microphone down there, please. Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry. I'd like to ask 2 questions, and I appreciate all these efforts. They sound very, very exciting, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the negative right now. First, number 1 is, how do you deal with disinformation in your community? People who are deliberately providing information that's incorrect, and you're counting on them for reporting. Is there a way to think about verification of your community info? The second question is about, it actually stems from an anecdote in my family. My daughter heeded a call from a German woman to knit hats for Syrian refugees. And she sent them in, and the German woman sent photos back, and she saw one of a little Syrian boy get the hat in December. It was a nice holiday story, and it ran on a syndicated TV network in the US. And what was most surprising was the community reaction in some of the communities was extremely hostile. And I'm sure Larry might be able to identify with some of this. So is it up to the news organization, when you're getting this kind of angry feedback, to be responding? Because they didn't. And I'm just wondering, are there best practices for engaging when the feedback from the community is actually quite hostile?
I can speak to the verification of information and then maybe open it up. For me, if somebody is coming through to us, through a tip phone or through anything else, you do what you would always do. You check who they are, find out, and now it's possible to find out a lot about people who are online, who have online presences, particularly if they're reaching out on social. And you can examine, what they've said about things in the past or how they're describing things right now. And there was a classic example that Josh demonstrated yesterday during the San Bernardino shooting, where somebody claimed to be there and witnessing the event as it unfolded, and it was clear from their timeline that they absolutely weren't there, and even how they were describing it. So everything from the language that people use to what their recent history is, and any agenda or bias that they do, and then checking with other people if you're suspicious. Who's your second source? Who's your third source? Same old rules. Maybe any other examples? Responses?
Well, 8 mails or whatever, I've received many, and I just deal with it as normal. But there's also a lot of disinformation by every media house. So I think it would be nice to have investigative journalists or a program that always checks on. I think the BBC used to do it at one time, but they check on each other, like a check and balance, that if like Al Jazeera or one big media reports something that is not true, another media house can pick on it and say, that's not true, we're there at the same time and we didn't see something like that. I mean, maybe that will, make people much more informed about what's going on. But, well, everybody has got its own opinion to respond positively or negatively, but it depends on how we deal with it. So that's my catch on it.
I think, so on the verification point, yeah, you always verify everything. Always. Nothing ever goes up unless it's properly checked, and ideally cross-checked. You verify the information, you verify the source. And if you find that there is a community member who is routinely giving you information that you can't trust, then most communities have modes and methods for dealing with that situation. Often you can ban somebody. You can potentially add an email address to just a list that basically says, don't ever trust anything this person says, which is fairly harsh. But if you have essentially a provocateur within your community, then that ends up being, probably the only way to really make sure that doesn't turn into sabotage. In terms of the way that we moderate communities, there's a lot of news organisations have, I guess, what you call debate communities around just everything that they do. One of the things that we do on The Guardian is we try to pick and choose where we open comment threads, for example, in order to minimise the potential for abuse, but also to make sure that we can be part of those conversations as much as possible, to make sure that we can moderate them, to make sure that we can kind of stay on top of what's being said, and engage with that and respond to that as and when necessary. And it's something that, we're not perfect on this. I don't think any news organisation is perfect on this. But I think it's absolutely crucial to try to manage and maintain and moderate conversations that are being had, especially on issues where there is a great deal of emotion prompted and potentially quite visceral reactions. And I think it's important for news organisations to think about the conversations that we want to have, conversations that we want to host, the conversations that we want to be part of, rather than opening up everything to everybody.
The last point I would make is one of the reasons I like looking at this issue through a couple of layers or levels, like I laid out in my slides, is because it's really easy for people to hear us up here talk and think that we're saying all journalism should look like this. And that's not what we're saying at all. That's the straw man that often gets held up. But in reality, what we're saying is that there's not enough of this, and we think there's a huge potential for more journalism that looks like this. But that doesn't mean that we eclipse or throw out important values like verification and getting it right, nor does it mean that we're going to investigate the mob through community engagement, right? I mean, there's always going to be stories that we have to do in a different way. And the same way we wouldn't do snowfall for every single story in terms of thinking about technology, we wouldn't do every story with engagement as well. So I think it's important to think about engagement as part of our tool set, a tool I think that we've underutilized and a way of building relationships that is really is necessary now, but it's not the end-all be-all either.
Hi there, I'm Maggie Murphy from Transparency International, the anti-corruption organisation. You stole the question out of my mouth about verification. We have reporting centres in about 60 countries where we have to deal with trying to figure out whether reports are actually legitimate or not. I think you've talked already about that. It'd be interesting to know whether you'd face any libel challenges as well. But another question is, you've been talking about some communities that are ready and willing to be engaged. Some of the stuff that we deal with, thinking about Panama, the Panama leaks at the moment, there's a lot of information. It's very, very technical. It's really difficult to communicate stuff to communities and engage with communities. Do you have any stories or have you tried to engage on issues that are just really, really difficult to communicate and difficult to engage communities? It's almost coming at it from the other way.
I can speak a little bit to that. Prior to the work that I'm doing now, I spent 7 years working in national campaigns around press freedom and also internet freedom issues. And a lot of what we were doing were talking about really wonky technical policy issues about how the internet is regulated, which if you go into a community and you try to get them to care about how the internet is regulated, it's really hard. And they don't necessarily understand net neutrality and some of these other issues. But if you start not by trying to convince them, but by listening and actually hearing about the things that they do care about, and then building bridges between the issues that you're working on and the things that they already care about, you can find a really fertile ground where you actually begin to learn a little bit about how the blind spots you have and how you speak about things, and the community can teach you to speak in a different language that's really rooted in their everyday experiences and how those issues relate. And so sometimes Mary, you said something earlier about listening and humility, and I think there's huge power in that, and sort of starting with the people and then trying to find your way. And it takes a long time. Sometimes it's a slow process, but finding your way to these other issues via their own concerns and issues.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said for asking your community what questions they have. So this is something we're doing on the Panama Papers. We have a call out open for community responses, genuinely saying what questions do you have about this, about the impact that it might have, about even the journalistic process that's been gone through to get here, about what happens next. And I think opening up and letting yourself listen to the questions your community has can sometimes be a really interesting way into those topics that are very difficult to explain. Because sometimes the questions that the community have are quite different to the questions that journalists are already asking. And being able to kind of open up your commissioning process, I guess, to interrogation from the audience can be quite powerful.
And John Crowley gave a great example of a type of dense story that might be similar to Transparency International stuff, where they broke down what Greece owes and when, and had 360,000 unique views on that particular story because they made a really nice graph of it, broke it down, made it interactive, and there were other similar lessons from engagement of readers over the course of the week. And then people who don't want to be engaged, for instance, a source. Some people don't understand what's public, what's private on social platforms, and I've had several instances like that where, you might contact somebody and then they realize, the information I've put out is public. They might be in Sierra Leone or somewhere and fear reprisals. So you just have to be cognizant of that as well, and always try to get people onto secure channels. I think we have to wrap it up from there. Thank you very much. of audience at The Guardian, and she helps maximize the reach for Guardian's work around the world, but also builds meaningful relationships between Guardian journalism and its audience. Larry McCauley, founder, host and presenter for the Refugee Radio Network, a platform organized by refugees for refugees in Hamburg in Germany. It was founded in 2014. And myself, I'm Malachy Brown. I'm managing editor of Reportedly. It's a first look media outfit, and we leverage social media to cover international news, conflict, social movements, and tech news. So we're going to get started with presentations. Josh is up first.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. A little bit louder now. Good morning, everyone. All right. You didn't think you were going to be able to come to an engagement session without being engaged, right? Good. We expect this to be a really good conversation, a good back and forth, and we really look forward to talking with all of you once we get through a little bit of how we think about engagement and what engagement means for us. So I wanted to start out telling you a little bit about the work I do at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, which is a place-based foundation in New Jersey in the USA. And we're working on a project right now where we're looking at how can we help support the future of local news, specifically a strong financial future for local news, in part by changing the way we do journalism to orient it more around community engagement. So we really think that if we need to rebuild how we do journalism and think about journalism much more rooted in communities and serving local communities if we want communities to continue to support journalism in new ways. And so we're testing a range of new membership models, event strategies, other kinds of services that news organizations can provide, but all of which are rooted in actually meeting concrete needs in local communities. And we are also experimenting with new reporting models that connect revenue strategies and community engagement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those today, but I want to talk about them within a framework that I hope is really helpful to you. It's a framework that we've used as we've been thinking about community engagement, and it's a 3-level framework that was first introduced by Joy Mayer, and I'm going to give you a link to her work as well. But the first one that Joy talks about, this is a map of some of the local journalism sites we work with in New Jersey. The first level that Joy talks about is community outreach. And I should say that these are levels as ways of creating a framework. They're not levels in terms of a hierarchy that suggest any one kind of engagement is more or less valuable. I think the type of engagement you choose to pursue should be related to the goals that you're trying to meet and the needs of your communities. So this isn't to say level 1 is less valuable than level 3. But level 1, community outreach. For Joy and the way that we've thought about this, it's sharing ourselves and our expertise with our communities and our content. It's taking content out to the audience, not assuming that we'll just put it on our website and expect them to come to us. And it's being willing to participate in our community as individuals, as human beings connected to our community in ways outside of our newsroom, not just as in relation to us as a reporter. And so I really like to point out the work of the Center for Investigative Reporting, also called Reveal, and their earlier project called California Watch, which did some really great work on this, 2 of which you can see on the slide here. So they did this really in-depth investigative series about lead jewelry that was showing up in California, even though California had outlawed these lead jewelries. This really cheap jewelry was showing up in department stores in California. And so they revealed this and showed how this lead was having an effect on people and the importance of getting this lead out of your homes. But they went a step further. They actually rented lead testing equipment. You can see a picture of it on the slide there. This kind of equipment is incredibly expensive. So it's not like the sort of thing that somebody could do in their own home. But they were able to rent this equipment as part of their investigation. And then they created community drop-in zones where anybody could bring their jewelry from home and get it tested for lead. So not only was that serving the community in a very direct public health way, it was also making that journalism relevant to the community in a really direct way and helping spread the word about this reporting. Similarly, they did an investigation on the earthquake readiness of local schools in California. And who is going to be most impacted by earthquake readiness of local schools? The kids who go to them. But the kids who go to them aren't going to read a 40-page investigative journalism piece. What they will read is a comic book. So the Center for Investigative Reporting took their journalism and worked with child psychologists and illustrators and created a age-appropriate comic book to discuss the findings of their research and talk to kids about the safety of their own schools in a way that was really appropriate and engaging. And that, of course, also led to having discussions with parents and led to their journalism having a real impact on families. So that's one piece where they've gone out into the community and done community outreach. Another example, moving to level 2, is what we look at as conversation. And this is more and more journalism is being created as a way to spark conversation with communities in ways where the journalism actually changes through that conversation. So this really means starting to listen in new ways, hosting discussions in person and online, participating in conversations that we're not necessarily hosting. So it's not always about us holding an event, but also us going to other conversations. And then recognizing that journalism is a process and that the process itself can change the journalism as we go.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Case for Engaged Journalism. I'm not Amanda Zamora. Poor Amanda is ill. She's taken ill, and she's not here with us today. Anyway, we'll carry on. So this is about engaged journalism, and very often when you attend panels about engagement, in management speak, that means how you get more traffic to your websites or how you build your user base. This is not that. It's as David Bowie described in that 99 interview, it's about the grey space between user and provider. And it's really about how you bring your audience and your communities into your journalism to strengthen that journalism. And one of the points we'll be discussing is whether we're at that point of a renaissance in journalism now, where crowdsourcing and engagement becomes part of what we do in storytelling and in doing good journalism. With us today are Josh Stearns, who leads the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation's Journalism Sustainability Project. That's focused on developing new revenue models for local news rooted in community engagement and creative collaboration. Beside me we have Mary Hamilton, who's executive editor